All right, for this video we're going to build a gauge layout, also called a dashboard, gauge panel, whatever you want to refer to it as. So in MPScandroid you'll go to main menu and click on miscellaneous, and this is the window that opens up. Up in the right hand upper corner of the blocks you'll see display layout. And since this was a fresh install, there's no layouts. So you'll want to create a new layout. So hit the menu button and new layout. It'll ask you if you do in fact want to create a new layout, and it gives you an opportunity to pick a new file name. I'm going to change my file name to just new config test. Oops. And now it's going to ask you what type of gauge you want to install. And for the purpose of this, I'm going to try and select a couple different gauges for you, and just be mindful that when you add, the order that you add your gauges is the order that they're going to appear in your log when it is in .csv format. So you might want to make a list of all the gauges that you intend to log and see if you want them in a certain order. Sometimes it's handy when you're looking at your .csv file to have certain things grouped together, like say all the timing retards. You'd want those just stacked right next to each other, maybe with your logging your timing advance. So that will be in one quick, easy reference section, 5 columns in your .csv file. One thing that most people use for some type of reference point, and that is the start of most of my logs, is the vehicle speed. So that vehicle speed is the first thing on my log file. So I'm going to add that first. Here the gauge is going to always appear in the upper left hand corner. So as you add gauges, you always want to make sure that you move them away from that. If you add another gauge that's an analog gauge, it's going to default to the same size, and they're just going to be sitting on top of each other. So you would just simply click on the gauge. It pulls up this pop-up window, and then you have the option of what you want to do. The first thing I do, like I say, is move the gauge. So when the pop-up window goes away, it doesn't look like there's anything going on here, but as soon as you touch on that gauge, it's going to highlight some grid lines, and then you'll be able to locate the gauge anywhere you want. So I'm going to try and make a simple configuration that just shows like a dashboard. So in this case, I'm going to relocate it to about there on the screen. I'm going to enlarge it by changing the size. And same thing, as soon as you touch on it, you'll get some grid lines. You can change the size. And I'm going to do the same thing. In order to add another gauge, you tap on a gauge and it gives you the window to add, and I'm going to add another gauge, and I'm going to add RPM. Again, I'm going to select just an analog gauge for and remember, on the user gauge, the RPM that we went right past it. The RPM that we modified was RPM 3D, and that was the incorrect gauge, because you can see when I added that gauge here, it's adding it as 8,000. So I'm going to move this away on the screen. Just this is where I'm going to put it, but I'm going to go back and make that change. If one good thing is anytime you make a change to this layout is save it. It's real easy to sometimes hit a button accidentally and then it will just wipe out all your work. So in this case I've hit saved. I'm going to go back and then in user gauges again, I'm going to try and add the correct RPM. And again, it was engine RPM, so it'll be under E in this list. Engine RPM HB. So I'm going to add that one. I'm going to change the upper display limit to 7,500. OK it. And then I'm going to save my settings. And since this other RPM 3D was not the correct one, I'm going to delete that. So you can click delete gauge and it gives you a pop-up and then lets you pick from the list which one you want to delete. And I'm going to delete engine RPM 3D. And again, make sure you save your gauge settings before you exit the screen. We'll go back to layout. And you can see the old RPM is still there, but I'm going to try and add the new one, and we should see a difference. Analog. And for this list is by the short name, so again we're just looking for RPM. And it's right here, 093. So you can see the difference between these two gauges. The upper limit of the lower gauge only goes to 7,500, and the limit of the first one that we added went all the way to 8,000. I'm going to go ahead and delete this one gauge that we added in error, and I'm going to move the other gauge. These grid lines help you line it up with other gauges if you want to try and keep a certain pattern. And I'm going to try and make this about the same size. So now we have a vehicle speed and an engine RPM. But the fonts are very small on this tablet. And we have the option of making changes to these gauge faces from the configure. You tap on a gauge, the menu pops up, hit configure, and then you have all of the gauge configuration settings here that you can change. And by far the analog gauges have the most adjustment. You can change all sorts of functions on how the gauges appear to customize it. I'm going to try and keep this simple for the demonstration. So you can see on the gauge that there are different colors. The actual tick marks of the gauge are that dark purple, and right now that's showing as a 10-point font. I'm going to change that to 25. This very light pink down at the bottom that says mile per hour is this pink, and that again is a 10-point, and I'm going to change most of these to be 25. And the last one that I'm going to change that's 25 is the script that says vehicle speed, and that's a green. The other one that I want to change while I'm here is the yellow. That's the actual value of speed that will be indicated, and I want that to be a large bold font. So I'm going to select 40 and see how that looks. Now, I mentioned it in another video, I believe, but one thing that you want to do before you hit close is you want to make sure that this last setting that you changed, that you click off of it, and you can click back to another one that you changed, but in clicking off of it, the change to 40 was the last change that I made, and that will be recorded. Otherwise, I found that it doesn't record it if you close that window. Even if it asks you to save, it won't capture the last one. So here we got a speedometer gauge that is a little bit more useful. And you can change, likewise, the settings on the RPM gauge to match. I'm going to hold off because I'm going to add another gauge. And one of the gauges that I want to add, even though I'm adding it out of the order that I would normally add it, is I want to add that analog gauge that I configured, the analog input gauge. And I'm going to use a digital gauge for that. Now, the analog inputs show in this RAM location to be on the top, and the analog inputs that will be functional with MPSCI link will be A1 through A4. I added my gauge as A4, so that's the one that I'm going to select. Now in that list, it was listed as A4, but you see when I added the gauge, it's listing a gauge name of AFR wideband out, and that's the name, short name that I gave the gauge in the user gauge settings. So again, first thing you want to do is move this out of the way. And I'm just going to move it over here to the side of the screen. And again, quickly, with the digital gauges, there are less settings to alter, but you still want to change a couple of them. And so you want to, I'm going to change the same ones. Green that indicates the gauge name, and yellow that indicates the value. The other one that you need to change here, right above it, you see analog port number. And you need to select here in the configure which analog input you're using. And in my case, this gauge was set up to be analog input 4. And again, you want to click off of it before you hit close to save those settings. Get rid of this keyboard here. Now you can see I got the same 25-point font on the green, and I've got a nice bold reading there. You can change colors. You can change the gauge background color. You can change the tick mark colors. So it's infinitely configurable. I'm going to add one more gauge for you as a demonstration, and it's a gauge that I haven't really used before, but I want to take a look at it myself. I'm going to add a new gauge, and I'm going to add it as a left analog. And in this case, I'm going to pick the coolant. Okay, so I just wanted to see how this gauge actually appears on the screen, what it looks like. And try changing the size. moving it back so it occupies the edge of the screen. So you can see this is just like an analog gauge, but it's just showing half a gauge. You can set these on the sides of your screen, and that's kind of neat. Again, the same configure. I'm not going to go through that because it's identical to what we've already gone over. I'm going to show you a couple other of the gauges. Another one that I use frequently is the bit gauge. And the bit that I monitor is the turbo flag. Again, move it away from the screen. I'm just going to put it in this corner and I'll enlarge it. Because again, we're going to change our font. Just going to quickly change the font just so you can see it better. I don't know how it's going to how it shows up on the screen there for you. Change this to 25. And the other thing I want to change is I need to change that purple, so it's easier to see. And that should do it. Okay, perfect. So you can see on this bit gauge, if you're using a turbinator-based cal and you're using the staging, the launch control, anti-lag timing, and the spark cut, you can see those when they turn on. So when you're staging, you'll see that bit light up if you over rev, and that should be true if you're on the turbinator cal or not. And the anti-lag timing retard is active when you're staging and you hit the trigger RPM. So you'll see those bits turn on, and that's handy to have in your log if you're data logging drag racing run. Another one, I'm gonna add another simple one for you that I find very useful. And before you lose interest here, I'm going to add a gauge, and I'm going to add one of the timing retards for cylinder 1. So I'm going to add that as a digital gauge, and the reason why I want to add that one is I want to show how you set up an alarm. And the timing retards are RET 1, 2, 3, and 4 for cylinder 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to move that over here to the bottom of the screen. And quickly, again, configure. You would configure the same font sizes and everything else, just like we've already done, that you're probably exhausted listening to me drone on about. But what I wanted to show you here was the alarms. So we selected the gauge configuration, and on the very bottom selection there's a little small area that's for alarms. I'm going to change that to true. And you can see when the gauge added, it had a value put in here, a 32, to display. When I change my alarm maximum, you should see the gauge go red, because what I'm going to select is I want to know if there's any timing retard at all. So I'm going to say if I want this to go red and indicate to me if I've got a timing retard in degrees, anything over 0. So I'm going to set it at 0.01. And again, you want to click off of that value before you hit close to make sure that it records it. And you can see that that block went red. So normally when you're logging, if you have all of these timing retards on the bottom of the screen and you have those set up to alarm, If you get any timing retard, the ECU knock sensor is picking up any knock at all, and the ECU starts retarding timing, your gauge will flash red. Stay red for the duration that the value is above that limit, and then it'll go back to normal when it drops under it. So that's a handy feature, and you can set that for your RPM also. If you want a soft limit for yourself that only is indication as opposed to hitting a rev limit, then you can use it as a shift light. Set your RPM gauge to flash red when you exceed a certain value. So I'm going to call it quits now for this video, but in a future video I'm going to have even more gauges added to a layout here, or I'll pull up another layout that I have already built, and we can go over some things with that. Thanks.